All right, last week we talked about how sometimes when the path that we're on doesn't look like what we expect it to look like, we have this image in our mind of how something should be. And we talked about somebody giving us directions, and we kind of mentally picture how it should be. And when it isn't the way it should be, we get confused and we get lost. And in those times in our walk in life, that it's those times when it doesn't seem right, that we really have to go back and just trust God's word. We can't really trust the feelings around us, the situation around us. We go back and trust God's word. And that was our memory verse for last week in Isaiah 55, that God's word is true. And this verse in Isaiah is also when he talks about, I send my rain out, and it's for a purpose, and it does what I sent it for. And it also says right in this right in these few verses around Isaiah 55:11, that God's ways are not our ways. And that when we don't understand his ways, to trust, his word has a purpose, and it does specifically what he wants it to. And that encouragement to trust God's word. It's learning to trust God's word and not trust our circumstances or our situation or our own strength through the difficult times that gets us through. Yeah.
Could I add a scripture?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In Habakkuk, strange book to find this, but
yeah.
Habakkuk 3:17 through 19. Though the fig tree should not blossom and there be no fruit on the vines, though the yield of the olive should fail and the fields produce no food, though the flock should be cut off from the fold and there be no cattle in the stalls, yet I will exult in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength, and he has made my feet like hinds' feet and makes me walk on my high places.
Mm-hmm. How many of you still have the magnet? You do? It made it through about 8 moves for me, and it was too trashed. It's a powerful verse. It's a very, very powerful verse. And Aspen did lessons on that. It's been about, 12 years ago. That's impressive, Bonnie. But that's just it. That goes right along with what we're saying. That even though, it's not what we expect, it's not what we want, nothing's there, yet I will rejoice. I rejoice because we go to God's word and we rejoice in God's word. And going through our storms in life, it's learning to look to God. We always there's 2 ways. You can look to the circumstance and your ability to overcome it, which just causes fear because you're not going to be able to overcome it. God's people never were able to overcome it. Or it's turning to God. And it's that ability and that learning to turn to God that we need to figure out what to do. Here in Hebrews 11:6, it says it's impossible to please God without faith. We have to please God. We have to have faith to please God. Everybody turn to Hebrews 6 and look that up. This is a very powerful verse because God says that I want you to draw near to me. I want you to draw near to me. And then he says that he rewards those who seek him. But faith, remember what faith is? Faith is believing when you can't see. It's when you can't see. That's exactly what faith is knowing that you're on the right path when it doesn't look right, when it doesn't feel right, when you're just sure this cannot be the right way. When all your senses say, this cannot be right, this cannot be the way God is caring for me. That's faith. When I say, I just want to be clear here, when I say that you can't see, God gives us a lot of evidence that we know we can trust God. When I say not seeing, I mean not seeing in that circumstance. In that moment, you don't see the blessings. They're not immediately right there. The second part of this verse is very powerful for me, that God rewards those who seek him. You know, God is guiding us on a path. And he says, I want you to go down this path. And I know many of you have felt this or feeling it now. You know, God says, this is where I want you to be. And I'm going to bless you in this. And you imagine this path. Like, okay, God, you're going to bless me. This is going to be a great path. And I'm going to move down it. And I just think this is what the Israelites were thinking when they had got out of slavery. God had rescued them. They were free now. They were going to be living in a land of abundance. And I can imagine, I think about what they thought about. What images did they have in their mind of how great this was going to be? But as they walk on that path, it wasn't what they imagined it. All of a sudden, that path is a lot darker. That path has a lot more rocks to stumble on. That path has a lot more shadows that are creepy, that they don't understand. And it has a lot of places where the path is completely blocked. You can't get past it. There's no way. There's walls there that you can't get over. There's giants there that you can't get through. I want us to read in, didn't write it down here, but I think it's in Genesis, Exodus. Let me see if I can find it right quick here. Exodus 23:20. So this is where it goes back to trusting God's word. When they go through there, when God is telling them, when he's leading them out, and he says, this is the land I prepared for you. He said, there are going to be people that you're going to fight against. He says in like verse 28, I will send hornets before you, which will drive out the Hittites. I can't find it in a few of these verses before here. He's saying there are going to be troubles, but I'm going to take care of them. But sometimes I don't think when they went in there that they thought those troubles were going to be so huge. They thought they might have been little boulders. They didn't imagine that they'd be complete blockades of their path. They didn't imagine they were going to be fighting the evil descendants of Anak, the Anakim people. I don't think they could see that. And when they did, when that path didn't look the way they had imagined it, what did most of them do? They rebelled. They turned their hearts against God. 10 out of the 12 people gave up their faith. It was 2 people that held their faith through that. 2 people who held on even though the path wasn't what they thought it was going to be. And who are those 2 people? Caleb and Joshua. Caleb and Joshua, they didn't focus on the troubles. They didn't focus on, okay, this isn't what we think it should look like. They focused on their God. I know that these stories, I'm not teaching these stories right now. We're just pulling little pieces out of them. And I encourage you to go back and read these stories. And just because sometimes we don't know where these stories are in the Bible, I just want to take a few minutes and give a quick overview of these first few chapters in the Bible to help us understand where we can read these stories, where we can understand where to find these. And so all these handouts I've given you here, pick up a set. There's 3 pages. And I want us just to go through a quick overview of the Bible. The first book of the Bible is Genesis. And that's just beginning. Gen means beginning, right? So it's simple. Genesis is the beginning of time. And get the one that looks like this. That's your first outline. And I just want you to see this. This is pretty powerful. That Genesis is really from the beginning of time to when the Israelites are getting ready to leave out of Egypt. And in this time frame, I circled it there. This doesn't work. So the pink circle, that's Genesis. Genesis covers 2,500 years. It's pretty amazing. In 50 chapters, we have 2,500 years. And in Genesis takes you all the way from creation and where men became evil and Noah built the ark. We have the flood. We come off and we have people building up, and then we have the Tower of Babel and the people scattering. God, I circled it right here. Abraham, we have the patriarchs when God calls Abraham in the story of his son Isaac and the story of his son Jacob. Jacob's name was changed to Israel, and then his son Joseph went into Egypt. So that all that is in Genesis. And then the next book we have, Exodus, is when they exit. And it's the story of God taking his people and exiting out of Egypt. And this is where we read the accounts of where God gave his people the law. This is where Moses went up on Mount Sinai and got the law. This is in Exodus when the people are moving out. And so this is when they cross the Red Sea, they get the law. And then the next book is Leviticus. And you can remember what happens in the book of Leviticus because the tribe of Levi were the priests. These are the people who set the law. These are the people who were the spiritual leaders of the tribe. So Leviticus is a lot of laws. This is how God says, these are the laws that you're going to live by in the land. And so really Leviticus is not the book you want to be reading going to bed at 11 o'clock at night. Unless you want to fall asleep really quick. Yeah, because it's a lot of the laws in here. And then Numbers sort of continues that. Numbers is the organization of his people. And Numbers talks about this is how I want you to live. It contains some more laws. This is what you do in certain situations. This is how you keep your community going. And this is also the time when he says, okay, now you're ready to go. I've brought you out. I've told you how to live. I've given you my law. Now go take over the land. And so this is where you can read about the spies going in Numbers 13 and 14. And then they come out and they rebelled. So now the rest of Numbers is them in the desert living this out. And then Deuteronomy is a wonderful speech given by Moses as a recap of Genesis through Numbers. And he's retelling his people. This is after they've been in the desert. And now God's saying, okay, now you're ready. Now you can go in. And he says, remember, this is what happened. Remember when God did this? Remember how this happened? You guys know the story. And we can also find the 10 Commandments in Deuteronomy because it's a recap of when they came out of Egypt. And whole Deuteronomy is telling them, hold close to your God. Hold tight to your God and he'll bless you. Don't rebel because there's consequences for rebellion as well. And that's repeated over and over in Deuteronomy. And so if you want to read the story about them going into the land, you're in Numbers. And then after that, Joshua is really the conquest of the land. This is when, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua is just in this little tiny line right there at the edge. Just this little tiny line when they're going to go in and take over. And Joshua, the book of Joshua, is when they go in and start the conquest of the land. And Joshua's at the helm and leading his people in and conquering. They take over Jericho, and then they continue on taking over all these other nations and groups. And then after that, Judges and 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles are really the living of the Israelite nation, how they lived. This is the, oh, you can't see it here. Right there. Those are the judges. And then we move into the kings. And so this is really them living. And then we move into the time of the what's that word? Prophets. And we move into the time of prophets. So all those stories of how Israel lived in the promised land are Joshua, Judges, and the Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. And so, and I'm not going to go on past that. But I just want us to have that overview because I know we don't all know these Bible stories. And when we skim over them so fast, sometimes we don't know. So go back and read them in Numbers, and then in Joshua. Let's see. So now, I want us to go through this timeline with me of when the Israelites came out and they were ready to go. Oh, just real quick, so you can see that other sheet there. I just think this is fascinating. That's Genesis. That's some of the people that lived in Genesis. And that shows how that Abraham could have talked to Noah. And so that's your 2,500 years in Genesis there. These are some of the major players just for information, because I think it's pretty cool. So not really relevant to this class exactly, but I want you to follow with me through this sort of this timeline of what happened with the Israelites going into the promised land. In Numbers, let's see, Numbers 13:33. We're going to be in Numbers and Joshua. So turn to Numbers 13 and Joshua 14. Joshua 10. Numbers and Joshua. Numbers. I'm pretty close. Numbers 13 and Joshua 10. Okay, so this is when God, everything they're now done being in the desert, and God says, you get to go in now. And Numbers 13:22 says they went up into the Negev and came to Hebron and some other towns. And the descendants of Anak were there. Now, just another thing I want us to point out that sometimes there's big words here, Negev, or sometimes it has a V on the end, Negev. It's just a desert. It's a word for desert. So it just they went in and spied out, and they went up into the desert and came to Hebron. The next verse I want us to look at is in Numbers 13:27. When they went in and spied it out, we've looked at this verse quite a few times, that the land was flowing with milk and honey, and however the people were strong, the cities were fortified, they were very large cities, and, that's a big word, and the descendants of Anak were there. But then we see, what does Caleb say in 13:30? But Caleb was one of the two. He quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it. This is the faith we were just reading about in Hebrews 11. The faith without seeing it. He saw just what they did. He saw the terror. He saw the bad, but he had faith, and he said, we can overcome it. Now let's turn over to Numbers. Numbers 14. Numbers 14:6. In this one, this is where Joshua and Caleb were talking to the people. And they said, yes, the land is exceedingly good land. And if the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into the land, and he will give it to us. We can trust God. Well, Caleb and Joshua were encouraging the people. Don't look at the problems there. Look to God. Okay, now we're going to go to Joshua. And now we're in Joshua 10. And Joshua 10, really, this is when they've moved in now. They've taken over Jericho, and they've started conquering all the nations through there. And it's pretty amazing. This is an amazing story. I really encourage you guys to read Joshua 6, 7, and 8, because it's pretty fascinating. They start taking over. They win the Battle of Jericho, and then they're defeated. All of a sudden, they're defeated. And Joshua's, God, what's happening? Well, there was disobedience. And that disobedience had to be taken care of. And once that disobedience was taken care of, then they continued on the conquest. And I love that because it shows it wasn't by their power. It was God saying, you're going to win, you're not going to win. And so they continued this conquest. And in Joshua 10, 36, it says, and Joshua and all Israel with him, and they went up from Eglon to Hebron, and they fought against it and captured it, struck it with the edge of the sword, and its kings and its town, and every person in it. He left none remaining. So Joshua and Caleb believed. They believed their God, and now it's coming true. Now they're seeing the power of God. They're seeing the power of God as they come through these towns that they had spied out. They had spied out Hebron. They just conquered Hebron, and they're moving through it. And what's powerful here in Joshua 14. Joshua 14, 7. Caleb says, I wholly followed the Lord my God. Isn't that a powerful verse? I wholly, with the whole of his being, followed the Lord. And then skipping down, let's see where we are here. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Yeah, okay, that's the next verse, sorry. Joshua 14:7. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land. And I brought him word again as it was in my heart. So he was 40 years old there. And then it says in verse 11, now behold, this day I'm 85 years old. And I am still as strong today as I was in the day when Moses sent me. My strength now is as my strength was then, for war, for going and coming. God took care of them. They believed in God. They wholly followed God. And God took care of them. Can you imagine having the strength as an 85-year-old as you had as a 40-year-old? Caleb wasn't just walking. Caleb was fighting. Caleb was fighting, wielding a sword. And he was doing it with the strength that he had when he was in there. This is God's care. This is God's provision. But I think that is so powerful. That's part of when we can't see how we're going to overcome something. And God provides for it. And this is such a testimony that how he took care of Caleb. Let's see. Okay. I want us to take a minute to think of this progression. Think of something that God has asked you to do, and you're excited about it, and you know God has a plan, and you know there's going to be blessings along that way, and you start walking it, and all of a sudden it's hard, and you really doubt it. You just doubt, and you think, I can't do that. I simply can't do it. Maybe I don't want to do it. I'm too scared. I don't want to climb that wall. I can't climb that wall, and I don't want to do it. And then you remember, I don't have to do it. God can do it for me. God can absolutely. So I'm going to walk. I don't know how I'm going to do it. I don't know what's going to be, but I'm going to wholly give my life to God. And I'm going to wholly believe in him and his word and his strength. And you start walking. And what's amazing, this is like what Caleb and Joshua did. And God gave them the strength. And God didn't just ask them. He says, I will take care of those people. I will take care of the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Perizzites. What is it? Perizzites? That word. He says, I'll take care of it. But who was doing the fighting? He didn't ask his people to sit back with their hands in their pockets. He says, you get out there and you fight. And I think about that. God says, you go forward, and all of a sudden you're out doing something. You're maxed to your strength. You're tired. You're exhausted. But God says, keep going. And this is what he did for Caleb and Joshua. He gave them the strength. I love that. He says, you're going to fight. I'm doing it. I'm the one who wins this battle. But you're wielding the sword. You're doing it. And that's how God is with us. God says, I'm right there with you. I'm going to give you the strength, and I'm going to bless you. And we see this, that he's blessing them over and over. And then I love this. So we're in I know where we're at now. We're in Joshua 14 at the very end. And remember how it said in Hebrews that draw near to God and he will reward you? Verse 13 says, Joshua blessed him, Caleb, and he gave Hebron to Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, for an inheritance. Therefore Hebron became the inheritance of Caleb, because he wholly followed the Lord, the God of Israel. Now the name of Hebron formerly was Kiriath Arba. And who was Arba? Does that not give you chills? When they first went into that land, the city they came to was Hebron. Caleb and Joshua followed God with all their heart. They did not care about the circumstances. They did not care about the obstacles. They did not care about the fear. They said, God will take care of it, and God did. But they had a job to do. When they were ready, they didn't doubt their strength. They went forward with what God had told them to do, and in the end, God gave him the city of the mightiest man of the Anakims. He turned that around. He took it from them. He took it from them and said, it's yours now. This is yours now. That's your reward. And I think that is so, so powerful, because he wasn't afraid of the Anakim. He wasn't afraid of them. He didn't care what those giants could do. And they were giants. He said, my God is bigger than you. And God showed it to them. He said, yes, I am. And he took that out. And you can read about this in all these battles before chapter 14, where the Anakim were destroyed. And now it belongs to Caleb. And I love that. And I want to encourage us to draw near to God, to seek him out. And we're going to talk about this next week, that to not look at our circumstances, and to have that encouragement that God not only is right there with us, but to hold on to the fact that he rewards those who seek him. He rewards those who draw near to him. And for me, that's like a step up, a big step up, more than just he's with you. He says, I'm going to bless you for that. And I want us to hold to that when that storm seems too hard to go through. And we want to be like the 10 people and just say, I don't want to deal with this. It's too hard. Don't do that. Be one of the 2 who knows that God will help you through that storm, and he will reward you in the end of that. We have a couple minutes. Are there any comments? Just a second here. I have one. You guys can talk while I'm looking here. Any comments?
I don't know if you're going to get into this in future lessons, but back in Hebrews in 11, where he is a rewarder of those who seek him, and that a lot of times we're looking at ways where they received the promise physically of here on earth.
Mhm.
But it says later in verse 13 of Hebrews 11, all these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance. And so, and then in verse 16, they desire a better country that is a heavenly one. That we don't always get an earthly reward,
Mhm.
but that our final reward is
Mhm.
our heavenly one. And so sometimes we have to comfort ourselves when we think the answer should be an earthly one, that we might have to accept that the answer is no here on earth. Because in verse 36, 37, they were tortured. These young Christians, they were experiencing mockings and scourgings and chains and imprisonment, and they were stoned, and sawn in two, and they were put to death with the sword, and they went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill treatment. But they gained approval through their faith, and they did not receive what was promised, but God provided something better for us. And that's our final resting.
Yeah, and I think, we always have to hold on. What our memory verse from last week was to know that God's word is absolutely true, but a reward, just like what we were talking about, his care and his compassion and his blessings don't always look the way we want them to. We have an idea of what that reward should be, and it isn't always what somebody else's reward was, but we can absolutely 100% be assured that God is faithful and he will reward us for that stepping out in faith, and that stepping out in trusting him in those situations will absolutely, it may, like you said, not be what we want or we expect, but it will be a reward. I hope you guys have a great week, and we'll see you next week. Bye.